The year was 2007, and the world was drunk on an intoxicating cocktail of easy money, suburban dreams, and mathematical arrogance. Skyscrapers in Manhattan were buzzing with the frantic energy of traders who believed they had finally solved the riddle of risk. They were selling the world a fantasy wrapped in AAA ratings, a financial alchemy that turned subprime mortgages into gold. Yet, beneath the polished marble floors of the global financial centers, the foundation was not just cracking, it had already disintegrated. While the masses were busy buying homes they could not afford, a small, isolated group of contrarians was looking at the same data and seeing something entirely different. They weren't looking at the prophets, they were looking at the rot. They were the prophets of the apocalypse, the few who understood that when a system is built on a foundation of lies, it does not matter how tall the tower grows. It will eventually succumb to the gravity of reality. But why was this prophecy ignored? Why did the most powerful institutions in human history, armed with the brightest minds and the most sophisticated algorithms, choose to look away? The answer lies not in a lack of information, but in a profound, systemic failure of incentives, greed, and a collective delusion that convinced the world that the rules of economics had somehow been suspended. To understand the crash, we must first understand the mechanism of the deception. It started with the securitization of mortgages. Banks would bundle thousands of home loans, including those issued to people with no jobs, no assets, and no prospects, and sell these bundles to investors as safe, stable securities. They called them mortgage-backed securities. The ratings agencies, entities paid by the very banks whose products they were rating, slapped a AAA label on this toxic waste. It was the equivalent of labeling a bucket of gasoline as fireproof. The banks were incentivized to keep the machine running because they were collecting massive fees, and as long as housing prices kept rising, the game continued. But there was a fundamental flaw. The debt was unsustainable. When the housing bubble inevitably began to deflate, the people who had bought those homes started to default, and as the defaults cascaded, the value of those securities didn't just drop, they evaporated. It was a chain reaction that turned the global financial system into a house of cards, waiting for a gust of wind. Among the few who saw the collapse coming was a man named Michael Burry, a physician turned investor who spent his days in a cluttered office, analyzing thousands of pages of mortgage documentation. He realized that the underlying loans were ticking time bombs. When he tried to warn his investors and the major banks, he was met with laughter, dismissiveness, and institutional arrogance. He wasn't just predicting a market correction, he was predicting the death of the status quo. He began to bet against the housing market, a move that seemed like financial suicide to his peers. But he wasn't alone. Other outsiders, people who operated on the fringes of Wall Street, started to notice the same anomalies. They saw the predatory lending practices, the falsified documentation, and the complete lack of oversight. They saw a culture where short-term bonuses were prioritized over long-term stability. Yet, the machinery of the global economy continued to hum along, fueled by the blind confidence of regulators who believed that the market was self-correcting. The tragedy of 2008 is that it was entirely preventable. It was not a natural disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake. It was a man-made catastrophe, constructed by people who knew exactly what they were doing and who stood to benefit from the chaos. The regulators, the central banks, and the political establishment had all the indicators they needed. They saw the skyrocketing debt-to-income ratios. They saw the proliferation of subprime loans. They saw the record levels of leverage. But they were captured by the very industry they were supposed to oversee. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington ensured that those in power viewed the market through the lens of the banks, not the public. They believed the industry's own propaganda that the risk had been diversified away. It was a collective failure of imagination, a belief that the system was too big to fail and that the prosperity of the early 2000s would last forever. As the cracks began to widen in early 2008, the panic was slow to set in. Lehman Brothers, once a titan of the industry, found itself holding billions in worthless assets. The desperation was palpable, but the public remained largely unaware of the extent of the rot. When Lehman finally collapsed in September, the shockwave was instantaneous. It wasn't just a bank failure, it was a total breakdown of trust. Overnight, the global credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other because no one knew who was solvent and who was a walking corpse. The world economy stood on the precipice of a second Great Depression. The response from the authorities was a massive, unprecedented bailout. Trillions of dollars of taxpayer money were poured into the institutions that had caused the disaster in the first place. The logic was that these banks were too systemic, too integral to the functioning of society to be allowed to disappear. But this created a moral hazard that still haunts us today. It signaled to the world that if you are big enough, you can gamble with the lives of millions, lose, and have the public pick up the tab. The aftermath of 2008 left a scar on the global consciousness that has never fully healed. Millions of families lost their homes, their life savings, and their faith in the system. The disparity between the wealthy, who were largely shielded from the consequences, and the working class, who bore the brunt of the austerity and the stagnation, became a chasm that continues to fuel political polarization across the globe. We learned that the experts are often the last to see the truth, blinded by their own proximity to power and their desire to maintain the status quo. We learned that the financial system is not a neutral arbiter of value, but a complex mechanism of power that can be manipulated for the benefit of a few at the expense of the many. And most importantly, we learned that the seeds of the next crisis are always being sown during the height of the boom. The hubris that led to 2008 is not a relic of the past. It is a permanent feature of human nature, amplified by the structures of modern finance. Think about the implications for today. Are we living in a different world, or are we just living in a more sophisticated version of the same illusion? Since 2008, the global debt load has only grown. Central banks have engaged in unprecedented levels of monetary expansion, keeping interest rates low and asset prices high. We are once again seeing a search for yield in an environment of low returns, pushing investors into riskier and more complex assets. The lessons of history are meant to be guides, not just stories we tell to feel wiser than our predecessors. If we fail to recognize the patterns of the past, we are destined to repeat them. The story of 2008 is not just about mortgages. It's about the fragility of trust and the dangers of unchecked power. It is a reminder that when the incentives of the elite diverge from the needs of the society, the result is always a reckoning. The question is not whether the system will face another test, but whether we have learned enough to survive the next one. The reality is that no one in power stopped the crash because they were the crash. They were the architects, the beneficiaries, and the ultimate victims of their own creation. The system was designed to reward risk-taking, provided that the risk was hidden behind layers of complexity and bureaucratic jargon. When the bubble burst, the focus shifted from accountability to preservation. The goal was never to fix the underlying issues. It was to prevent the total collapse of the financial architecture. This meant that the fundamental problems, the lack of transparency, the excessive leverage, and the misalignment of incentives remained largely intact. We have essentially built a bigger, more complex machine that is even more dependent on the continuous flow of credit and the stability of asset prices. It is a precarious existence, sustained by the hope that the music will not stop, or that if it does, there will be someone there to start it up again. Reflecting on this, one must wonder, who is watching the Watchmen today? In an era of digital finance, decentralized platforms, and algorithmic trading, the complexity has only increased. The speed at which information travels has created a market that is more reactive, more volatile, and more prone to herd behavior than ever before. We are no longer dealing with simple mortgage bundles. We are dealing with synthetic derivatives, high-frequency trading strategies, and opaque leverage chains that span the entire globe. The potential for a flash crash or a systemic failure is higher than at any point in history. And yet, the narrative remains the same. The system is robust, the regulators are in control, and the growth is sustainable. It is the same siren song that played in the halls of Lehman Brothers in the summer of 2007. It is the sound of a system that has forgotten how to be afraid, and that is precisely when it is most dangerous. The history of finance is a history of cycles. There is the period of expansion, the period of exuberance, the period of crisis, and the period of reflection. We are currently in a state of long-term reflection, but the cycle is already turning toward the next phase of exuberance. The challenge for the individual investor, for the citizen, and for the student of history is to remain vigilant. We must look past the headlines and the official narratives. We must ask the difficult questions about where the value is actually coming from and who is holding the bag when the tide goes out. The story of 2008 is a masterclass in reading the signs, in understanding the mechanics of risk, and in recognizing that when everyone is screaming that everything is fine, that is the moment to start looking for the exit. It is a story that demands our attention because it is the story of our future. If you look closely at the modern indicators, the levels of corporate debt, the valuation of tech stocks, the reliance on government intervention, you can see the echoes of the past. The names of the assets have changed, but the underlying psychology of greed and fear remains constant. The question is not whether you can predict the exact day the market will turn, but whether you can build a life and a portfolio that is resilient enough to withstand the inevitable volatility. The people who made fortunes in 2008 weren't lucky. They were observant. They were the ones who took the time to read the fine print, to question the consensus, and to have the courage to act when everyone else was paralyzed by the comfort of the status quo. They understood that the truth is often hidden in the boring, tedious, and overlooked details that the mainstream media ignores. As we move forward, consider the role you play in this grand unfolding narrative. Are you a passive participant in the machine, or are you an active observer of the reality behind the numbers? The financial system is not some mystical force beyond our understanding. It is a human construct, subject to the same flaws and biases as any other aspect of our society. By educating yourself, by questioning the authorities, and by maintaining a healthy skepticism of institutional narratives, you are already ahead of the game. The crash of 2008 was a defining moment of the 21st century, a traumatic event that reshaped the global economy and the political landscape.